On Tuesday, April 5th, 1994, I reported for duty in Washington as the new Director of Strategic Plans and Policy in the Office of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I was one of several officers interviewed by the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General John Shalikashvili, for the job. And unlike most other military assignments, he had the only and final say, subject, of course, to the approval of the Secretary of Defense and the President. The Chairman of the Joint Chiefs is by law the principal military advisor to the President as well as to the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Council, and the Congress. And as the J5, my responsibility was to work for General Shalikashvili to help him in the policy and strategy area for the U.S. Armed Forces. I did this by working with the National Security Council staff, the State Department, as well as the offices of the Secretary of Defense, and with the military services. General Shalikashvili said, "Your job is to drive the staff." I thought I understood what that meant, but I was fresh from my latest post as commander of the 1st Cavalry Division at Fort Hood, Texas. I had 17,000 troops and 280 tanks, and I knew when I came to the Pentagon this was going to be quite a change. The next day, on another continent, the leaders of 2 fragile African countries, Rwanda and Burundi, were killed when the airplane they were flying was shot down on the way back from a conference in Tanzania. A day after that, 10 Belgian peacekeepers were murdered in Rwanda. It touched off a civil war and ethnic genocide that would leave as many as 1 million civilians dead. And then on that Saturday morning, I was sitting at a conference table with President Clinton's Secretary of Defense, William Perry, discussing a trip to Korea to prepare for possible war in Korea. On Sunday, I came back into duty, and this time in the White House Situation Room, I was backing up Admiral Bill Owens, the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, as he and the Secretaries of State and Defense and the National Security Council advisor tried to hammer out rules for when to shoot down Serb warplanes over war-torn Bosnia. This was a lot coming really quickly. I had about 300 officers on the staff, and we could handle a lot of work. But still, ethnic conflict was raging in Yugoslavia's breakaway republics, including Bosnia and Herzegovina. Yugoslavia itself at that point consisted now only of Serbia and Montenegro, and this conflict threatened peace and stability throughout Europe. The White House a few weeks later asked for an options paper on what could be done. So that summer I visited Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina. It's a small Muslim-majority country that declared its independence from Yugoslavia in 1992. I met there with the United Nations commander and with top Bosnian Muslim political leaders. And I walked the trench lines around the capital with the Muslim soldiers. And then I accompanied the United Nations military commander in the theater, British General Michael Rose, to meet the Bosnian Serb Army commander, Ratko Mladic. I needed to understand the perspectives of the opposing sides in order to write that options paper. And did I get an earful? Later, Mladic would be prosecuted at a United Nations War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague. Between the breakup of the former Soviet Union in 1991 and the growing tensions in the Balkans, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, which included the United States, was about to move to invite 3 new members to join. These were the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary. This was a unique period in American history, driven by ideals rather than fear, led by diplomacy, but reinforced by the military might of what had become the world's sole superpower. For me, it meant using all my military skill and experience and learning firsthand the language and logic of diplomacy as well as strategy. In fact, I was about to enter a kind of partnership with U.S. Ambassador Richard Holbrooke. Holbrooke was a brilliant, ambitious diplomat. He was a strategist. He saw power and influence the way an artist sees light and colors. He'd served as an aide to 2 American ambassadors in Saigon during the Vietnam War. Later, he'd been a junior member of the U.S. delegation at the Paris peace talks in 1968 and 69. And during the Carter administration, as the Assistant Secretary of State for the Far East, he'd helped reestablish diplomatic relations with China. More recently, Holbrooke had seen the tragedy in Bosnia unfolding firsthand. Now, having just been named Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Holbrooke was pushing hard to expand NATO and for U.S. intervention in Bosnia. The idea of NATO enlargement had been enshrined in the alliance treaty since its inception in 1949. But the dissolution of the former Soviet Union and the outbreak of fighting in former Yugoslavia lent new prominence to this concept. Secretary Perry and my boss, General Shalikashvili, were saying no to enlargement, principally because it would be a mistake to offend Russia, they thought. But Holbrooke won the policy fight inside the U.S. government, and I became the lead staff officer responsible for designing and selling the enlargement program to NATO. Meanwhile, events in Bosnia were worsening. Muslim forces were under siege in Sarajevo and had been for years. And finally, in May 1995, they fought desperately to break that siege. But the Serbs fought off their attacks and drove the Muslim forces back in. Serb forces then counterattacked against Muslim civilians in the so-called safe areas that were nominally under UN protection. In July 1995, Bosnian Serb General Ratko Mladic overran the town of Srebrenica in eastern Bosnia and Herzegovina, and he had some 7,000 Muslim men and boys then trucked off into the forest and shot. The world was outraged as the news became clear. But 3 years of diplomatic efforts and UN peacekeepers on the ground had proved futile in stopping the war. NATO determined that it would strike and punish the next Serb transgression. Meanwhile, in the United States, a 7-point peace plan was constructed that included both carrot and stick, inducements and threats. With backing from General Shalikashvili and Secretary Perry, I became part of that U.S. delegation working with Assistant Secretary Holbrooke. We met with Croatian President Tudjman in Zagreb, Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic in Belgrade. We asked Milosevic, we said, Mr. President, should we deal with you or should we deal with these Bosnian Serbs that are part of the conflict and Mr. Karadzic? This is Mr. Karadzic, the Bosnian Serb leader whose forces had recently done the massacre at Srebrenica. Oh, with me, he said, you would call these Bosnian Serbs country cousins. But we asked, you're the president of a neighboring country. Why would they respond to whatever you agree with? And Milosevic answered, they will not deny the will of the Serb people. Implicitly, he was confirming what the international community already knew, that it was he who controlled the war, not the Serbs on the ground inside Bosnia. Traveling next to see Bosnian President Alija Izetbegovic, members of our delegation suffered a fatal accident on the steep mountain trail coming off Mount Igman overlooking Sarajevo. 3 of our colleagues died in that accident. A week later, we returned to continue our shuttle negotiations with a new team. The Serbs had struck a marketplace in downtown Sarajevo with a mortar shells, leaving 37 people dead and dozens injured. Even as we were meeting with Serb President Milosevic again, NATO launched airstrikes against Serb positions in Bosnia. So this was going to be not just diplomacy, but diplomacy backed by force. Over the next 2 months, we convened repeatedly with the warring factions. Ultimately, we held 3 weeks of face-to-face dialogue and mediation in closed sessions at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Dayton, Ohio. And there, in tough negotiations, we succeeded in ending the war in Bosnia, the worst fighting in Europe since World War II. In December 1995, President Clinton and other heads of state met with the leaders of the warring parties in Paris and formally signed the agreement to end the conflict. NATO forces quickly moved into Bosnia in late 1995 to enforce the peace agreement. But we had not stopped Milosevic, not yet, as we would soon discover. In July 1997, I was confirmed as Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, head of all NATO forces there. I was also head of U.S. European Command. It was the position Ike had created when Harry Truman sent him to Europe in early 1951. I lived in a chateau and worked at two different headquarters, one for NATO in Mons, Belgium, the other for U.S. forces in Stuttgart, Germany. I was responsible for major headquarters running from Norway to Italy, for all NATO military activities and exercises involving NATO's 16 member nations and 24 partner nations, and for U.S. forces and military efforts in 89 countries, including Israel and most of Africa. It's the top command position in the United States Armed Forces. My wife, Gert, was happy that we at least were no longer scrambling from one Army house to another. This was our 28th home in 33 years of marriage. And at the same time, the job was 24 hours a day with lots of travel. NATO Secretary General Javier Solana told me my primary NATO mission was to implement the Dayton Peace Agreement that I'd helped negotiate. Not just the military accords with the 30,000 NATO troops on the ground, but essentially the whole agreement. Solana, a Spanish socialist, was a rare soul. He was a physicist, Fulbright scholar, former foreign minister of Spain, and an early opponent of Spanish membership in NATO. And yet he became among the most effective NATO Secretary Generals in our history. He was brilliant, tireless, thoughtful, and loyal. We became close friends. At the time I assumed NATO command, NATO forces in Bosnia had picked up a new mission, and that was to arrest war criminal suspects indicted by the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal. These suspects were all Serbs of various ranks whose names and criminal actions had become known to the tribunal. Needless to say, President Milosevic felt threatened, and he responded with a series of threats, protests, and violent demonstrations delivered by Serbs across Bosnia. United States forces were a special target, and we responded robustly. We blocked rioters, we disabled inflammatory communications, and we pushed back hard. In one action, we ran Serb forces off a key microwave relay site, extracting from the Serbs a humiliating promise that they would behave before we would return the site to them. Shortly after this, we obtained intelligence that Milosevic was plotting to have a Bosnian Serb rival, Biljana Plavšić, assassinated during a pre-election rally in Bosnia. We intercepted buses carrying the protesters whom Milosevic had planned to stage at the event. We forced them to unload repeatedly. We confiscated their billy clubs and 2x4s, and we delayed their travel. By the time the buses finally arrived at the rally, it was long over. Milosevic himself called me the next morning, pleading he must have his people, his intelligence agents who were going to manage the assault, released. We did, but we had assured that Mrs. Plavšić would be elected to the presidency rather than be assassinated, and Milosevic suffered a huge loss of face. We also took other actions to pressure the Bosnian Serbs, like confiscating the automatic weapons of the Serb Special Police and closing certain police stations. This was using forces without using force to enforce the Dayton Agreement. Having met most of the Serb leaders during the peace negotiations, taking meals together, talking about our families, arguing, conferring, I understood something about the psychology and the politics and where the pressure points were. And I had a good sense of just how far to push. Accordingly, I was given remarkable freedom of action by NATO and by the White House. In February 1998, a Serb political military crackdown began in the Albanian majority province of Kosovo, some 200 miles to the southeast of Sarajevo. That spring and summer, the Serbs' use of force escalated into an ethnic cleansing campaign against the Albanian population. The Serb military would surround Albanian villages. The Serb special police would enter to arrest and eliminate Albanian lawyers, doctors, human rights workers, and then the Serb thugs would come in to rape, steal, and pillage. Hundreds of thousands of Kosovars fled to their mountains. In NATO, all military planning has to be politically directed and politically approved by each member nation. As a military man, you can't just sort of create a plan. So at NATO's direction, I now drafted concept plans for airstrikes and even ground force intervention. Ambassador Holbrooke was called back to try to reason with Milosevic. Once more, this would be diplomacy, this time backed by threat. Holbrooke carried the first message. Then Secretary General Solana, German Army General Klaus Naumann, the chairman of NATO's military committee, and I all traveled to Belgrade. We did it repeatedly to impress upon Milosevic the seriousness of a UN Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire and an end to hostilities in Kosovo, as well as support for human rights, international monitoring, and the use of force if he didn't comply. In one session, I actually delivered face-to-face, one-on-one, a threat to strike Serbia to Milosevic. All that pressure worked, but only temporarily. In January 1999, Serb forces again went after the Kosovar Albanians. The French stepped in to lead another diplomatic round, but Milosevic was in no mood to settle. He chose war instead. So we would need real military plans. But U.S. intelligence had identified only a few targets. The United States had been focused on North Korea, Iraq, and increasingly Iran. So Washington had to scramble to make up for lost time. Admiral Jim Ellis, the NATO Commander-in-Chief for Allied Forces in Southern Europe, and Air Force Lieutenant General Mike Short, who'd be executing the airstrikes, came to me. They said, "Sir, we've got to have a knockout blow, like we did in Desert Storm 8 years ago." And indeed, that's what U.S. military doctrine would call for. I knew that because I'd helped craft the decisive force ideas years before. But this was to be an allied action. NATO Secretary General Solana warned that if I demanded NATO approval for massive strikes, the member nations would disapprove, and the result would be no action whatsoever. He left the choice to me. But of course, it really wasn't a choice. We couldn't stand by and do nothing. We had to maintain NATO unity at all costs, even if it meant violating sound military doctrine. On March 7th, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright warned me in a meeting that Milosevic had threatened to kill Albanian civilians if we used air power. "What can we do?" she asked. Strike and strike harder was the only answer I could give. Peace talks in Paris broke down. The United Nations withdrew a civilian observer mission from Kosovo, and Western embassies sent non-essential staff and dependents home. Holbrooke delivered an ultimatum to Milosevic on Monday, March 22nd, 1999. No use. So, on instructions through parallel chains of command, the United States and NATO, we initiated operations on the evening of March 24th. We would strike 50 targets in the disputed Yugoslav territory of Kosovo with F-117 stealth fighters, F-15 Eagle fighters, and ship-launched Tomahawk cruise missiles. In some quarters of NATO, there was hope that these strikes would force Milosevic to come to his senses and resume negotiations, but he didn't. On succeeding nights, then we struck again, each time a little heavier, and we were into strikes on Belgrade by the following week. We increased the numbers of aircraft, the types of targets. We came in from all directions. We ramped it from 300 aircraft to 1,000, supported by the U.S. Navy, Marine, Italian, French, and British forces. At one point, we had 5 aircraft carriers offshore. We hit air defense sites, we hit radars, we hit communications, we hit ammo storage, supply points, parked military equipment, headquarters, command centers, electric power generators, oil refineries, bridges, everything that could cripple the Serb military efforts in Kosovo. Milosevic, of course, attempted to retaliate, but without much success. He then tried expelling tens of thousands of Kosovo Albanians south into the tiny independent Republic of Macedonia, hoping to rupture a fragile ethnic balance there. but NATO forces were on hand and they helped handle the refugee flow. Milosevic also blasted propaganda and misinformation into neighboring countries, aiming to disrupt support for NATO, so we knocked out his broadcasting capabilities. He sought help from Russia, and we dissuaded the Russian fleet from sailing. As the fighting progressed, Milosevic reinforced Serb forces inside Kosovo to intensify his ethnic cleansing. And Kosovar civilians fled, some 900,000 to neighboring countries, another 500,000 into the mountains to hide. During this period, Serb special police and paramilitaries targeted and killed several thousand civilians. We hadn't been able to use decisive force, but I'd learned my own lessons from the Vietnam War, and I aimed at least for what was known as escalation dominance. This was to convince Milosevic that we could intensify our actions and whip him at every level of conflict, no matter what he tried, and that he had no option other than to give in and pull out of Kosovo as the NATO alliance had directed. In the past 4 years, I spent hundreds of hours with him over the course of countless meetings and negotiations. I felt I knew how he thought, and I knew how to beat him. We identified more targets. We increased the numbers of Allied aircraft. We even brought in the B-2 stealth bombers and special GPS-guided munitions. We cut off Serb access through Bulgaria and Romania, both of which were then aspiring to join NATO and later became members of the alliance. We prepared to use Apache helicopters to target Serb forces in Kosovo. We began to plan a substantial ground invasion. Milosevic, no doubt, knew all of this. Simultaneously, a paramilitary organization known as the Kosovo Liberation Army attacked from Albania across the mountains into Kosovo. It could do so thanks to help from the British SAS, Special Air Service, and probably also the Central Intelligence Agency. This forced Serb ground forces to mass, and we brought in US B-52 bombers on them. I also used the media against Milosevic. I concluded every press briefing by saying, "We're winning, he's losing, and he knows it." I knew he was watching. Simultaneously, we helped draft a peace proposal that Finnish President Martti Ahtisaari and Russian leader Viktor Chernomyrdin would carry to Belgrade. Pershing and MacArthur would have envied the way in which we could combine military action and interact at the diplomatic and political levels. It was just the way Eisenhower had envisioned it. Despite our progress, some hostile critiques came from the sidelines. Some said we shouldn't be involved at all. Some asserted we could never succeed with air power alone. A French army officer even gave away some of our plans to the Serbs, allegedly under orders by French intelligence to make sure that Milosevic knew we were deadly serious. The officer later was convicted of treason in a French court. The truth is, we did violate most of the principles of war in order to hold NATO together politically. We telegraphed our punches. We slowly escalated. Because I was operating in two different chains, the NATO chain of command that ran through Brussels and a U.S. chain of command from Washington, unity of effort came through me. NATO operates on the principle of unanimous consent. It's difficult to get, but NATO's political leaders learned as the struggle went on that they couldn't afford to lose. So if we could hold NATO together politically, ultimately with the preponderance of power that we had, we would win. When you're using air power, of course, there's always mistakes. It's inevitable. Despite the great airmen, there were mistakes like striking a train crossing a bridge, a malfunctioning bomb hitting a schoolyard, targeting a holding area for Kosovar civilians held hostage by the Serbs, and we struck a building in Belgrade that turned out to be the Chinese embassy, based on mistaken data from Washington. But after 78 days of bombing, 36,000 sorties, 23,000 bombs and missiles, covert training for the Kosovo Liberation Army, plans to bring in several divisions of NATO troops, and a full-court diplomatic press, Milosevic gave in, and he agreed to pull out his forces. On June 10th, the United Nations approved NATO forces' entry into Kosovo and the area's occupation. NATO Secretary General Solana called to offer congratulations. He said, "Wes, you've done it. They said it couldn't be done with an air campaign, but you did it." Of course, I didn't do it. Our victory was the product of the collective armed forces of NATO and especially the United States Air Force, and also the product of our political leadership at the top. President Clinton, Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, Secretaries of State and Defense, who did all the hard work behind and above me to make sure we could put the military effort on target. But after Solana's call, I finally slept through the night. It had been a long 3 months. Unfortunately, the next morning, a Russian peacekeeping force, nominally under my command in Bosnia, took off on a 16-hour drive through Serbia to occupy the airport of Pristina near Kosovo's capital. It was Russian special ops driven by Russian intelligence. The Russian special op was an end run designed to undercut NATO's success and retain much of Kosovo for the Yugoslav Serbs. And they almost succeeded, thanks to NATO political ambivalence and some mistakes by elements of the NATO forces waiting in Macedonia. The Russian foreign minister kept telling the world it was all a mistake. And then, just as we feared, the Russians occupied the airfield. The next day, Saturday, some 25,000 NATO forces began to enter Kosovo in accordance with the UN authorization and the peace agreement. But as they got to the Russian-occupied airfield, late in the day, British Lieutenant General Sir Mike Jackson found himself blocked and driven back by Russian armor. In Moscow, the Russians now alerted airborne brigades to fly in as reinforcements. A tense 48 hours passed. But what could have turned into an even more severe NATO-Russia crisis was diffused by the steadfast refusal of Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria to permit Russian overflights of their troop transports. The crisis resolved itself. The Russians, without logistics or reinforcements, eventually gave up the airfield. We'd pressed very hard to win in this struggle, in a very unconventional fight. And some 1.4 million Albanians quickly returned to their homes. In 2008, Kosovo was recognized as an independent country. They love Americans. They even named a few babies after me there. As for the other side, the Russians, and especially Vladimir Putin, who was making the transition from the spy agency and state security apparatus to the prime ministership and then to the presidency, they no doubt took their lessons and bided their time. In an after-action review some weeks later with the other regional commanders, one of my colleagues asked, "Who gave you the authority to say you'd win?" It was a good question. But if he'd been an Army officer, if he'd suffered through Korea or Vietnam, maybe he wouldn't have asked that question. We'd learned the answer. No more Vietnams. When American forces are committed to battle, they must win. And if you're the overall commander, you have to find the strategy to do it.